now in session. The Honorable Kathleen Kennedy-Powell, Judge of the
Good morning. We're once again on the record in the case of People versus Simpson. The defendant is present with counsel. The people are represented. Mr. Matheson, if you retake the stand, I remind you that you remain under oath. Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Matheson.
Good morning.
I think where we left off yesterday, you indicated that you tested item number 49, which was the blood drop from the trail left at 875 South Bundy, shown in close-up in photograph E, and shown in perspective in photograph D. Do you recall saying that?
That's correct.
And you tested that initially to determine if it was of human origin?
Yes.
And with respect to the blood samples that were retrieved from the defendant and from Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson, with respect to those samples, did you test them also?
Yes, I did.
What tests did you perform on those?
On those, I performed the ABO blood typing test, the Group 1 enzyme electrophoresis test, and the PGM subtype electrophoresis test.
And did you also subject the blood drop from the trail, item number 49, to those same tests?
Yes, I did.
Did you prepare a chart, sir, indicating what you found?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have a chart I previously shown to the defense as it was marked Table 24.
All right.
Showing you People's 24, sir. You recognize what I'm showing you?
Yes, I do.
What does that chart show us?
Well, just a summary of the results of the analytical tests that were performed on those items.
With respect to the ABO typing performed on each of the blood samples, with respect to the blood from Nicole Simpson Brown, item number 59, the ABO typing result was?
That I determined that she was a type A.
And as for Ronald Goldman, item number 60?
In that case, I determined that the results indicate that he's a type O.
And as to the defendant, item number 17?
That he is a type A.
And as to item number 49, the blood drop?
That the tests indicate that it is of a type A.
Now, what do you mean when you say indicates?
Well, during the course of ABO typing, there's actually two different constituents that are present in the blood that can determine what the ABO type is. One of them is called antigen, and the other is called an antibody. If we only determine one of those two, we call it indicative of. If we're able to determine the presence of both the antigen and the antibody, and they confirm the type, then we just call it a type A, or a type O, or a type AB, or type B, depending on whatever it turns out to be.
Does that mean when you say indicative of O that it might not be O?
No, it just means that I was only able to, either only one of the tests worked or I only ran one of the tests. I just was not able to confirm the results with the other one.
Have you performed ABO testing before, sir?
Yes, I have.
About how many times?
Well, I didn't break it. There's a variety of different type of ABO tests. I didn't break it down to the individual ones, but in my career so far, I've run an ABO typing test a little over 6,500 times.
In those 6,500 times, have you had the experience of doing the initial run for ABO typing and come up with an indication of a type, as you've indicated here, like indicative of A or indicative of O, and then had an opportunity to run the second test on the antibodies to confirm that result later?
Yes.
In any of those cases, did it turn out that the initial indicative of type, whether it be O, A, or A, B, or B, turned out to be wrong?
I don't know if I would say turned out to be wrong. Occasionally there are discrepancies that occur between the two, and then we come up with what's called an inconclusive result. Normally, you can, through further testing, try and decide or determine why it may not have come out as clearly as you expected, but occasionally it does happen where your first indication, your first test is not how it's eventually reported.
And how often does that happen?
I don't have a number. It happens fairly rarely.
Now, in this case, after the ABO typing, did you perform further typing?
Yes, I did.
And what was that?
Well, there was additional test run that I mentioned before, the Enzyme Group 1 test, which includes actually 3 different enzymes in one process. One of them is the ESD, or esterase D, that's indicated on the chart. Another is PGM, or phosphoglucomutase, and the third is GLO, or glyoxylase. Those 3 enzymes are all run in one process.
With respect to the Nicole Simpson Brown sample, item number 59, what was the ESD result?
A type 1.
With respect to Ronald Goldman, item number 60, what was the result?
Also a type 1.
And with respect to the defendant, item number 17?
Also was determined to be a type 1.
And with respect to item number 49, the blood drop?
That was also determined to be a type 1.
Thus far, with respect to the markers that you found in item number 49, excuse me, item number 49, would it be a fair statement that only Ronald Goldman could be excluded from having been the source of that blood drop?
If our only population are the 3 people that are being described here, yes, he's the only one of those 3 that can currently be excluded as being the source of that blood drop.
Then you performed the PGM subtype test,
Yes.
and the result with respect to Nicole Simpson Brown in item number 59,
I determined that she was a PGM subtype 1+,
and Ronald Goldman, item number 60,
that he was a 2+, 1+,
and the defendant, item number 17.
was determined to be a 2+, 2-.
So each of the 3 parties there are a different PGM subtype, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
With respect to item number 49, the drop of blood on the trail at 875 South Bundy, what was the PGM subtype?
The PGM subtype on that sample was determined to be a 2+, 2-.
Based on the 3 people that you see on that chart, could Nicole Simpson Brown have left the blood drop at 875 South Bundy marked item number 49?
No, with the inclusion of the PGM subtype information, she's excluded as being a source of that sample.
With respect to Ronald Goldman, based on the PGM subtype, could he have been a source of that blood drop on the trail known as item number 49 at 875 South Bundy?
No, he could not.
With respect to the defendant, could he have been the source of the blood drop that was found on the trail at 875 South Bundy, known as item number 49?
Yes, he can be included in the group of possibles.
Now, did you make some effort to determine what the frequency or number of percentage of the population that could have left the blood sample that you typed out in item number 49 as indicative of A, ESD type 1, PGM subtype 2+, 2-? What percentage of the population could have left that blood drop?
Okay, I determined that that combination of those 3 type genetic markers exists in approximately 0.43% of the general population.
Well, Your Honor, we'll object to the admission of this evidence for lack of foundation. If the prosecution is going to offer a computation based on the multiplication of the frequency of 3 different types of or enzymes in the blood, we're going to have to show that these are independent random variables that can be multiplied, and there's been no foundation for the independence of each of these calculations.
Well, there's been no foundation as to how this particular number has been arrived at, so maybe you want to go into that.
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Tell us how you arrived at that frequency, sir.
Well, within our laboratory, since actually the beginning of the serology unit, we have kept information on all the whole bloods that have been run by that unit, all the genetic marker types that have been determined on all the victims, suspects, witnesses, whatever blood sample happened to come into the laboratory. And through doing that and identifying the different types, we've been able to establish percentages of the population that have a particular type. For example, in the ABO blood typing system, we've determined that approximately 34% of the population is a type A, approximately 16% is a type B, approximately 4% is a type AB, and approximately 46% is a type O.
And how do those tables compile, if you know?
The tables or the information is just an ongoing process. I've, for the last approximately 10 years or so, have on a annual or semi-annual basis added up all the types that we've determined during that previous time period, added it to the quantity that we had before, and performed the calculations.
And approximately how many times have you performed such calculations, sir?
Like I said, I do it approximately annually, anywhere from 9 to 18 months, and I would say maybe 9 or 10 times we've brought it up to date.
And on how many occasions have the people in your lab testified to frequencies of types that are found in evidence stains and in various persons in courts of law?
Well, I'm not sure I can give a specific number on it. I know that I have testified personally in blood-stain type cases approximately 115 times. Out of that, frequencies are brought up in at least half of those.
And in each case, was the frequency based on the tables you've mentioned using the multiplication system admitted in the court?
Yes, it has.
Is the system of multiplying each of the factors to achieve a frequency, an overall frequency, a method that is accepted in the scientific community, sir?
Yes, it is.
And then you reported that the frequency you found to be for the typing that you found in the blood drop on the trail at 875 South Bundy was 0.43%?
Approximately that, yes.
Your Honor, if we could hear the witness.
All right.
Mr. Matheson, how many PGM subtype tests has your laboratory performed?
Well, I have specific figures on the number that I have run. I determined that I've done approximately 1,000 items by the PGM subtype method. The only information I can supply you as far as overall laboratory is since we started computerizing our statistics, which was the first part of 1990, and since then the laboratory as a whole has done a little over 1,800 items by that method.
Now, you indicated that you've done about 6,500 ABO typing tests.
Yes, that's correct.
But you've done less than 1,000 PGM subtype tests.
No, slightly over 1,000, that's correct.
All right. So you do a PGM subtype in about 1 out of 6 of the tests where you do an ABO type.
That's approximately how the math works out, yeah.
How do you select which cases you're going to do a PGM subtype?
Well, it depends an awful lot on how much sample there is to begin with. Our protocol has tended to be to do the ABO first and then go on to the electrophoresis systems. I've mentioned earlier this group 1 system, which includes PGM as one of the enzymes in it. That you normally try and run first and determine what the PGM type is, not the subtype. And if you don't get a PGM type, then there's no reason to expend further sample running the subtype system on it. So many times we don't run it.
Would you say then that there's some sort of random selection of the PGM subtypes from the larger group of ABO types that you do?
You mean as far as the ones that appear in our frequency charts or in the ones that are run?
What I'm saying is that the individual cases where you have determined to run a PGM subtype are not a random sample of the ABO type test that you've done.
I am not totally sure what you mean by random. I do know that, we follow certain criteria as to whether we run a particular test, and it depends on the quality of the sample. The data that appears in our frequency charts is based strictly on whole blood samples, not evidence stains. And we will not run a particular marker in a whole blood sample if we don't have something to compare it to in the stain. So I'm not sure if that's random or not, but sometimes we run it, sometimes we don't.
And the frequency chart that you maintain for PGM subtype, that's just based on the PGM subtype test that you have done in your laboratory.
That's correct.
And you compute that by race of the subject that you're testing?
No, the statistics that we keep within our laboratory, the general population statistics that I've used to calculate this, do not take race into account.
So you have no race-specific frequency data for PGM subtype?
No, that's not true. The chart that I used in this case and that we use regularly on all of our analyzed evidence reports does not break it down by race. However, we do maintain reference books in the laboratory that does if it's needed.
And these reference books would refer to frequency data collected in other laboratories?
That's correct.
But you just used your own data?
Yes, we always do.
And your data is race-specific for neither the ABO nor the PGM subtype?
No, we don't determine race on any of our frequency determinations that we have. We don't feel it's our job to determine what race left a stain. We just have a stain of an unknown origin, so we choose to report a general population statistic.
But yet you're aware that there are dramatic differences in the frequency of blood type, for example, among blacks or African Americans as compared to whites.
Whether it's dramatic or not, it depends on the particular marker. I do have data here on the racial breakdown on the 3 genetic markers that I did run in this case, in case that information was needed.
Well, are you aware, for example, that other data suggests that type B is twice as frequent among the black population as it is among the white population?
Well, I don't know specifically what it is. I'd be happy to look it up and confirm it, but I'll accept the fact that there can be major differences, particularly in the ABO system. In the PGM subtype system, it doesn't vary quite as much as that.
You're not aware that there have been reports in PGM subtypes of ratios as great as 3 to 1 between races?
Oh, it wouldn't surprise me that if in specific populations it can vary by that much. That's one reason why up to this point I've specifically mentioned that these frequency determinations were approximations.
And what you've done in order to come up with this 0.43% or 1 in 200 is simply take your calculations of the frequency of each of the markers and then multiply them together to come up with 1 in 200?
With the 0.43, that's correct. And then I kind of rounded up for ease of understanding to approximately 1 in 200.
What is the frequency of type A that you used to multiply?
For the data that I have there, I used 33.7%.
And for the PGM subtype 2 plus 2 minus?
1.6%.
And you simply multiply those together to get the 0.43%.
Well, also included in there is the esterase D type 1, which I used 79.6%.
Now, you have made no effort to correlate the frequency of PGM subtype with the frequency of a particular result in the ABO test, have you?
Oh, you mean to see if there's any sort of correlation between the two?
Exactly.
No, within our laboratory we have not done that. I have learned throughout my training and have been advised that they are independent.
Been advised by who?
I don't have any specific name or reference. It's just been something that's occurred during the course of the last 12 years of my serology training. It's my understanding that they are independent factors.
There's none of the testing that you have done or the accumulation of data that you have done attempts to correlate how frequently you would have a 2 plus 2 minus, for example, in an A blood sample as opposed to a B blood sample or an O blood sample or an AB blood sample.
No, within our laboratory we have never done those calculations.
Your Honor, we would renew our objection based on People versus Collins that the multiplication of these factors is improper unless they can lay a foundation to show the independent appearance of each of these factors that they're multiplying.
Ms. Clark?
Yes, Your Honor. Counsel's raising the possibility of linkage, and I think that with maybe a little bit further questioning, I can establish that that is not an issue in these particular markers. That's more an issue in other areas, if I may.
All right.
Thank you. Are you familiar with the term linkage, sir?
Yes, I am.
Are you familiar with any studies that discuss the possibility of linkage in the systems that you've tested for the purposes of your testimony today?
In this particular case, dealing with these factors that have been around for and used for many, many years, I right here cannot specifically come up with any studies. It just is something that has existed for quite a while.
In the scientific community, has there been any concern voiced that with respect to the ESD or PGM subtype testing? I'm sorry. Where did you leave off? Has there been any agreement concerning the existence or non-existence of linkage with respect to the ABO, ESD, and PGM subtype categories?
My understanding is there's general agreement that there is no linkage between any of these factors.
So that, as of this date, the scientific community agrees that there is not the problem of linkage that might otherwise skew the frequencies that are reported in all these cases where these particular markers are tested and found in blood types and in blood stains for the purpose of determining frequency.
That's correct. These sort of determinations have been being made and used in court for in excess of a decade.
Does the court wish me to further inquire?
No, the objection, the defense objection at this time is overruled.
Thank you. Now, you indicated, sir, that you do not, the table that you like to use does not break down by race.
That's correct.
Is that a more conservative approach than focusing first on the race of a suspect and then extrapolating out from that to see what tables would be fit based on...
The characterization is conservative.
Sustained as to what that means. I think it's vague.
Okay. Why don't you like to consider race when you determine the frequencies and choose your tables?
There's actually a couple of reasons. I believe I mentioned one earlier, in that as a criminalist, as a scientist, I receive a piece of evidence that is, say in this particular case, a blood stain that was left on at a crime scene. I have no knowledge of who potentially might have left that behind. I don't want to assume that it is a Caucasian or it is a black or it's Hispanic or something along that line. So I prefer to use our general frequency considerations that we do, because it gives kind of a middle number where all the different races are considered within the population of the city of Los Angeles. Like I mentioned earlier, I do have statistics broken down as to how it might be given a Caucasian, black, or Hispanic. But I don't prefer to use those just for the reasons that I mentioned. Also, I feel it's important for us to have our own data that we can support, that we know where the information came from, and it's not always possible for us to receive information as to the race of an individual whose blood that we're typing. And even if we did have a process of receiving it, there's some question as to the validity of how that's determined. Does the person that's drawing the blood just look at them and make their own determination, or what? So we prefer to go with the general characteristic.
If, for example, sir, you were to consider, first of all, well, the suspect is white. Therefore, I'm going to look at the tables for white people concerning the frequency of each marker that you're testing. Does that basically begin by narrowing the focus, by making the assumption that your evidence stain will be from a white person?
That's correct.
And in that regard, sir, then might that distort the frequency to make it unfairly more incriminating than you otherwise might have if you did not make any assumptions about the possible source of a blood stain?
Well, depending on how it happens to work out for that race, it could be either more or less incriminating.
But either way, it might distort your result if you were to narrow the focus by making an assumption that the person who left a stain is of the same race as the suspect.
That's correct.
And you did not do that in this case.
Not for purposes of the report or the chart.
Now, I take it, sir, then, that you found, as you reported, that the types detected in the blood drop of item 49 left on the trail at 875 South Bundy occurs in 0.43% of the population?
Approximately 0.43, that's correct.
And who, among the three that you have listed in the chart marked Peoples 24, could possibly have been the source of that stain?
Of the three people that are described both in my report and on the report, only Mr. Simpson can be included in that percentage of the population that could have left that stain.
So Mr. Simpson alone is included in the 0.43% of the population that could have left the blood drop on the trail at 875 South Bundy?
Of the three people that are mentioned on the chart, that's correct.
Then by my math, we may, if my math is any good, we may fairly say that 99.57% of the population is excluded as a possible source of the blood drop found on the trail at 875 South Bundy, marked as item number 49?
That's correct.
I have nothing further.
Mr. Uelmen.
Mr. Matheson, the frequency tables that you rely on, you indicate, are based on the tests that are done in your own laboratory.
That's correct.
And you accumulate this data over a long period of time.
Yes.
Now, as a police laboratory, the tests that you conduct ordinarily are people who have been arrested as criminal suspects or the victims of criminal activity.
That's true.
That's not a random sample that is representative of the population as a whole, is it?
No, it is not. It's, like you mentioned, victims and suspects in the city of Los Angeles.
And in fact, ethnic or racial minorities would be substantially overrepresented in that group, wouldn't they?
Objection irrelevant.
Overruled.
Well, like I mentioned, we do not get racial information on most of the, or all of the samples that we receive, but logic tells me, yes, that's probably the case.
Well, for example, would you dispute that the African American population in California is about 7%?
That's approximately what I've heard. I don't have those statistics with me.
But yet, for arrest statistics and arrest data, they account for from 30 to 35% of arrests, don't they?
The same thing, I'd have to accept your data on that, but I believe it's in that area.
All right. So minorities are much more likely to appear in the group of persons that you are testing for blood or bodily substances than they appear in the population as a whole.
That's correct.
So the frequency data that you come up with may not be replicated if we were looking at the frequency in the population as a whole.
That's true.
Now, tell us a little bit about your laboratory. How many serologists do you have employed in your laboratory?
Well, first off, all of our professional staff are criminalists. They are not necessarily hired as serologists or toxicologists or narcotics chemists. Within the serology unit right now, I have 6 people working.
Now, do all 6 of these people work in the same laboratory?
Same physical location, yes.
In one room?
Yes.
All right. And all of your tests are performed in that one room.
Yes, that's correct.
Does your laboratory follow the FBI guidelines with respect to controls for contamination?
I would have to see exactly what they are. We do have a number of controls regarding contamination in place.
All right. Controls for contamination are pretty important in a laboratory doing the sensitive kind of testing that you do, are they not?
Definitely.
And occasionally there have been problems in laboratories doing this sort of testing with respect to what are called blooms of contamination.
I'm not sure what you mean by blooms of contamination.
That's not a term you've heard before?
Not in relation to the type of testing I performed here, no.
Have you heard that with respect to DNA testing?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Well, you do DNA testing in your laboratory, don't you?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Your Honor, we would offer to show that the contamination with respect to DNA testing could affect the accuracy of results with respect to other forms of testing of blood and bodily substances as well.
Well, Mr. Uelmen, there's been no evidence presented, and in fact, the prosecutor was specifically asked whether they were going to be presenting DNA evidence in this proceeding, and the answer was no, and therefore I don't think that's relevant at this time.
I'm not proposing to offer DNA testing results. What I am proposing to explore is whether there has been a problem of contamination in the laboratory in which Mr. Matheson is employed.
Your Honor, the witness has already indicated that the type of contamination that that Mr. Uelmen is referring to does not occur in the testing that he has conducted in this case.
As your question relates to DNA testing contamination, the objection is sustained.
All right. Let me ask you more broadly. Have there been any problems of any sort of contamination in your laboratory?
Objection irrelevant.
Overruled.
To my knowledge, we have not had a problem with contamination within our laboratory.
Have there been documented examples of contamination in your laboratory?
Not to my knowledge.
And do you do a regular regimen of testing to see whether you have any problems of contamination in your laboratory?
Well, every one of our tests has built-in controls that would indicate whether or not there is a contamination or any other form of quality control problem.
All right. And do you regularly do proficiency testing of your results?
Yes, we do.
And do you have an error rate compiled for your laboratory?
Of the proficiency tests, both external and internal, that we have performed, there have not been any errors.
What kind of external testing do you have of your proficiency?
We subscribe to two different services. The one that has been around the longest, that we've used the most, is from a company called CTS, or Collaborative Testing Service.
And do they use blind testing?
No, they do not.
So you have never utilized any blind testing of your proficiency by external sources?
Well, I think I need to clarify how you're using the term blind. We receive the items. We know that they are proficiency test samples. We do not know the results prior to our completion of the test and submission to them. But we do know they are proficiency test samples.
So there is no routine process whereby you test samples without knowing that they are part of a proficiency test.
That's correct.
Now, all of the tests that you described today that you did on the 3 blood samples and the blood stain are exclusionary tests. Is that correct?
If you mean by that, yes, we attempt to exclude somebody.
None of these tests can tell you specifically that a particular blood stain was left by a particular person.
That's correct. There's nothing here that would individualize a stain to any one particular person.
So any attempt to analogize this to fingerprints or precise identification of a person would be inaccurate. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, the tests that you performed produce some sort of product or result that other people can look at and interpret besides yourself?
In the case of the electrophoresis test, yes, we photographed the results.
You photograph the plate on which the test is performed?
That's correct.
And did you do that in this case?
Yes, we did.
All right. But there is nothing preserved with respect to the ABO typing?
No.
So no other person could interpret the results that you received from that?
Well, there is my raw data. In other words, the readings that I had as I was performing the test itself. Beyond that, no. All that's left is some additional sample that could be tested by somebody else if need be.
Okay. Now, normally, the ABO testing, for example, is going to be more accurate if you are testing whole blood samples, is it not?
I don't know if it'd be more accurate. Once we supply an answer, the answer, in my opinion, is accurate. The whole blood samples tend to be easier to analyze than a stain.
All right. And would that also be true with respect to the other tests that you performed here, the Group 1 and the PGM subtype?
No, not necessarily. With those tests, we take them basically to the same point where we're drawing down a part of the liquid sample to create a stain, and then we test the stain.
Is there any relationship between the age of a blood stain and how successful these tests are?
Yes, there is.
And what is that relationship?
Well, as a stain gets older, the likelihood of getting conclusive results becomes less and less. The factors that we're looking at are biological in nature, and unless they are stored in a proper condition, will eventually rot and be untestable.
At what point, for example, would you be unable to successfully conduct a PGM subtype test?
Like I said, it varies depending on the conditions. I have not been able to detect PGM on a stain that was picked up out at a scene as short as a week later. In that particular case, the stain was subjected to direct sunlight on the pavement for in excess of 24 hours, I believe. And I have also, on the converse side of that, successfully gotten PGM on stains that were 5 to 6 months old, but had been collected fairly quickly and then stored frozen.
So the promptness with which the samples are collected and how they are stored can have a significant impact on these tests. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, you were not able to get conclusive results with respect to item 49 on all of the tests that you conducted, were you?
That's correct.
All right. Could you explain which of the tests you conducted gave you inconclusive results?
I'm going to refer to my report, copy of my report. Okay, in relation to item number 49, I got no activity for the GLOW test, or the GLOW enzyme.
The GLOW was part of the Group 1 test that you did?
Yes, that's correct.
What would account for that you would not get any results on the GLOW, on the Group 1 test?
The most likely answer is that some degradation of the sample had occurred. The GLOW or GLO enzyme degrades very rapidly, and we probably get less or fewer conclusive results from that one enzyme than from any of the others.
Does the fact that you get inconclusive results on the Group 1 test in any way raise doubts as to the results you get on the PGM subtype test?
What do you mean as far as I'm assuming at this point you'd be talking about the PGM result that is derived during the course of the Group 1 testing. And inconclusive merely means that there's some question about that particular reading. And if it was a straight inconclusive or a no activity, then I would be concerned a little bit about the result that was obtained on the subtype test. I would like to have a confirmation. In this particular case, item number 49 exhibited a 2 plus 2 minus. I would expect the PGM to be a 2. They would correlate there.
Now, the PGM test is the same test that you rely on for the glow enzyme, isn't it?
Well, it's all part of the same run on the same electrophoresis plate. It's not necessarily the same test. It just so happens you can develop different portions of the same gel for different enzymes.
Now, you make one assumption in the test that you conduct on item 49, and that is that the substance you are testing emanated or came from one individual, don't you?
I don't assume that while doing the test, no. I run my analysis. I do assume that when I'm doing the frequency calculations, that's correct. But as far as the rest of the testing goes, it doesn't matter whether it's a mixture or not. The results are obtained and they're recorded.
Are you saying you would get the same results that you're reporting here even if the stain that was being tested was a mixture that came from two different individuals?
Well, this particular stain gave the results that were obtained. If there's more than one individual present in that, it would still give the exact same results because that's what was obtained on the sample. If you are saying that this sample was mixed with the blood of another individual that had different genetic marker types and are exhibited here, then the results would have reflected that.
Well, let me give you a hypothetical. Assume that we had a assailant with type O blood who was injured in the course of the commission of a crime. And on that assailant's hands were blood of the victim, which is type A. If those two bloods were mixed and the drop that you are testing was some mixture of those two blood types, what result would you get for your ABO test?
As far as the example that you gave, the results would be the same here. It would be indicative of a type A.
All right. So you wouldn't know that there was a type O assailant because you're assuming that this all came from one person.
Well, back to the other question, I'm not assuming that it did come from one person. However, the results that you obtained during the testing of a blood stain in the ABO blood typing system, if it's strictly from a type A person, you could have the presence of the A antigen or a combination of A and H, which ultimately indicates a type A. A type O person has this H antigen present in their system. So if you have a mixture of blood from an A person and from an O person, you'd also see the A and H, and ultimately would be indicative of a type A.
So you get the same result.
That's correct.
So if the scenario I presented involved an assailant with type O blood and 2 plus 2 minus PGM mixed with the blood of a victim who had a type A blood and a 1 plus PGM subtype, would you get the same result you have here?
No, given the scenario you just described, in the PGM subtype system, I would expect to see a 1 plus 2 plus 2 minus.
All right. Now, is there any quantitative variation in that mixture in which you would not see the 1 plus PGM subtype?
Sure, at some point, if the mixture of blood that was the type A PGM subtype 1 plus got down low enough so that the 1 plus was no longer detectable, then yeah, theoretically that could happen.
What kind of mixture would that be? 20 to 1?
I have no idea.
No idea?
No.
So if there were a possibility of mixture, that would substantially affect the calculation of frequency of occurrence that you presented here today, wouldn't it?
If it was required to calculate a frequency, then we would also have to include in that frequency the population of type O individuals.
All right, well, what difference would that make if we included both O and A in the ABO results and then multiplied it by the frequency you're using for PGM subtype?
Well, if you give me a moment, I'll calculate that for you.
Thank you.
The way I figure it, rather than having a 0.43% of the population approximately, it would work out to approximately 1%.
All right, so instead of 1 in 200, it would be 1 in 100.
That's correct.
Now, when you talk about that kind of frequency in a population the size of Los Angeles, for example, where we have 8 million people, you're saying that there are something on the order of 40,000 to 80,000 other people whose blood would produce the identical genetic markers that you have identified in item 49. Is that correct?
Approximately, that's correct, yes.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Ms. Clark?
Yes. Mr. Matheson, is there anything in the stain that we have marked as item number 49 that indicates to you that it is indeed a mixture of blood from two people?
Well, I would not necessarily know that. Like I mentioned earlier, the results would be the same, but there's nothing specific to indicate a mixture or whether it's not a mixture.
If indeed item number 49 came from two individuals, then they would both have to have a PGM subtype of 2 plus 2 minus, somewhere in there?
You'd have to have at least one of the factors. If it's, approximately equal mix, like I mentioned earlier in the example that was given, if it was a different subtype, I would expect to see that other type show up. So if we did in fact have a mixture, the additional blood would have to be either a 2 plus 2 minus, or a 2 plus, or a 2 minus.
And in fact, at least none of the other two victims have that.
That's correct.
And then that other person would also have to be a type 1 for ESD,
That's correct.
and an O or an A as to the ABO system.
Yes, that's correct.
Are you familiar with the term known as titering?
Yes.
Would you be able to, if asked, titer the stain known as item number 49 with respect to ESD or PGM subtype to determine the quantities with respect to being able to either rule out or limit the possibility of it being the blood of two different people?
I don't believe that would be appropriate testing to determine something like that. I'm not sure you could determine something like that.
Is there any testing you're aware of that could narrow down that could eliminate completely the possibility of that being two people?
Not to my knowledge, no.
But there was no independent evidence that you were able to find that determined that in fact that was indeed the blood of two people?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Uelmen, anything else?
Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Matheson, If we had a mixture that included PGM subtype 2+2- plus some other subtype, at some point in terms of the ratio of the mixture, the other subtype would be masked or would not appear in your results. Isn't that correct?
Is this similar to what we were talking about before, if there was a completely foreign type besides the 2+2-?
Right.
That's correct. If you got to a point where the other blood was diluted to the point where it didn't show up, then you wouldn't see it.
But you would still see the A result on the ABO test.
I suppose at some point it's possible where you'd still see the A and not the subtype.
Thank you. Nothing. Excuse me. 1 minute. Do you make some sort of calculation of how much of the sample you are consuming in the course of the tests that you're running?
Are you asking me, can I tell you how much I used?
Yes.
Yes, I can. Refer to my analysis notes. I consumed a portion of one of the swatches that was available to me that was approximately 6 millimeters by 3, approximation. That left 2 swatches plus a portion of that one remaining that I worked on.
So each of these tests that you perform consumes a certain proportion of the sample that you have available to test.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. I'm sorry, one other question.
All right.
With respect to the sample of the item number 17, the blood of O.J. Simpson, did you similarly inventory how much of that sample you consumed?
The proportion that would be consumed would have been a stain of consisting significantly less of than 1 drop out of the vial, which when I received it had about 2 milliliters of blood in it. So it would have been a insignificant